Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Beyond Day One. Today, we're going to be talking about something that I think is pretty important, and it's something that uh, honestly everybody goes through it at some point or another. But I know that it can be particularly hurtful for Gen Z. And what I want to talk about is how to recover from a bad interview. Look, we've all had bad interviews. So that's not it's not abnormal. And I don't want you to feel again like something's wrong with you because you had a bad interview. In fact, statistically speaking, that when things don't go well in an interview and then it happens again or there's a series of interviews that things don't go well in, we have a tendency to internalize the problem and we begin to look at ourselves as if we're broken, we're failure, or we're missing something that would help us make the difference. And so I don't want you to internalize. I want you to begin to look at how you can change things up if you've had a bad interview. As usual, I'm not by myself. I've brought with me Philip Rich and Gen Z John. He's with us today, and we're going to talk about this together. Gentlemen, how are you?
Doing
Doing
great.
pretty well.
How about you?
So just amongst us, anybody here ever have a bad interview?
Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's all of us. Bad interviews aren't necessarily a bad thing. Let's start there. A bad interview can actually be a platform or a lifting off spot, if you will, to better interviews and into the job that you really want. So let's talk about it a little bit. Philip, anybody feeling ready to share their bad interview experience? John, you want to share one?
If I must learn from my mistakes, please. Um, I've I haven't had necessarily let's not call it a bad interview, but I haven't had great interviews. Right off the top of my head, I think that there are just some bad first impressions that I've made that made the interview process very difficult. However, I was still fortunate enough to, have the person, come around and actually like me later on and actually hire me on. But man, it was tough because that first impression will either make or break the situation, almost break your whole job situation. I was being kind of, I don't want to say, selfish, but definitely kind of thinking on the fly a little too much to where I was saying things that don't really aren't really important to the conversation and start they overthinking and overcompensating for the conversation. And next thing you know, I'm oversharing information that the person just doesn't need to know. Next thing you know, where that weakness where I tell them I'm over communicative and I just to make sure that everything is over communicated, all of a sudden they're actually starting to see that that is an actual weakness, not necessarily just something fancy for someone to hear, for the interviewer to hear. So yeah, I've yeah, I've been there before. It is no fun at all. It was tough to
Mm.
recover from. Oh
Yeah.
my
Philip,
goodness.
can you think of a bad interview you had?
Yeah, it's just embarrassing. It's like you get a total cringe moment when you think about when you look back on it. But it was like my first real job interview. I was interviewing to become a what they call a stock associate at a department store. In other words, I put stuff on shelves. But anyway, um, during the interview, I just had the nervous energy going pretty high. And I remember near the end of the interview, the lady who interviewed me said, "Well, you're quite bubbly." And I
Oh yeah.
just wanted to literally melt into the chair and never be seen again. It was that kind of thing. And I was like, oh my gosh. And even to this day, when I think back on that, how I probably was coming across but didn't realize it, uh, it's a cringe moment for sure, man. You have all, like it just never escapes you. And I was very young, so it's one of those things where my inexperience obviously was showing, and it was just things you wish you could do over. That's for sure.
Yeah. Look, if there's the first takeaway of a couple that we want to give you is that it happens to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like in John's case, it didn't go great, but you still got the job. In other cases, you don't get the job. And then you begin, and usually it's when you don't get the job that you begin to question everything,
Yeah.
and you begin to question your choices and decisions in life. Why did I say this? Why didn't I say that? You become, they say hindsight is 2020. So after the
Yeah.
interview and things have gone wrong, you look back over it and you say, I should have said this and I should have done that, and then I should have hit her with this. And you've got all these things that in hindsight you could have done differently. Well, the reality is that you can learn from that. That's not a bad thing. Once you have a bad interview, the worst thing you can do is pretend like it never happened and keep going just as you are.
Yeah.
Having a bad interview, typically, going back to what we talked about last week, typically indicates a couple of things. Number one, that anxiety is at play. And if you, for those of you who didn't get to attend the webinar that we did about from anxiety to offer, one of the things we began to realize is that anxiety narrows our thinking. And then when we start narrow thinking things, we begin to miss opportunities. And we miss opportunities like we begin to ramble about things. We also begin to forget the things we freeze and forget the things that we want to say or intended to say. And it all turns into just a big bowl of mush, and it turns into really that bug bowl of mush turns into a bowl of regret. And so as we look forward and we think about, man, what is it that I could do differently from having a bad interview? One of the things, and John said it, he alluded to it. One of the first things is stop flying by the seat of your pants in interviews. That is old and dead. To walk into an interview and to just think you got it is probably one of the fastest ways to fail in an interview. Philip, talk about that for just a moment.
Yeah. Preparation is vital, and it's surprisingly underrated. You know, what you what you can learn in your preparations for interviews is that having the rehearsals of what you would say in terms of the questions you might answer, uh, also anticipating some of the questions that person might ask that are common interview questions. That's an important thing to already have in your pocket when you show up to the interview. More than likely, there's going to be some version of "Tell me more about yourself." They might even ask about what your life is like outside of work. What kind of hobbies do you have? Things like that. Also, tell me your strengths, those types of things. These are ideas that definitely you should be thinking over way before you get into that interview room, just to have at least a general sense of where you might start when you want to talk about those things. Very, very important. Without proper planning, you end up with poor performance. That's an old saying my mom has said many, many times before, and it stuck with me because it's true. So definitely make sure that you don't underestimate the power of good preparation.
And look, let's just talk about preparation, because really preparation is the answer for anxiety. We
Mhm.
move because what does anxiety mean? Anxiety means that there's a sense of uncertainty and a lack of clarity around what you're doing. When it comes to the interview process, there is this sense that, the person who's interviewing me is in the seat of power. They know what they're going to ask, but I don't necessarily know what they're going to ask, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And then they have the decision making power to determine whether I'm a good fit for this job or not. So there's anxiety, it includes, there's this sense of, they have power over my situation. They can make a quality decision about me. They can determine, they get to choose how they feel about me. That leads to anxiety. The other thing that leads to anxiety is just a general lack of preparation. And when you're uncertain and unclear about what's happening around you, The only answer is preparation. Why? Because you have to begin to eliminate the things that you do have power over in order to improve your interview outcomes. So that means things like, I'm going to dig into this company a little bit and try my best to better understand not just the mission statement and a few things. Dig in a little bit, read more about what goes beyond the mission statement to better understand them. You might be surprised to find that that can become a talking point during the interview that shows that you have a deeper understanding of them than other people who may have come in to interview. Also, take the opportunity to practice, just like Phil says. As an actor, one of the things that we always did or were told to do is go to practice your lines in front of the mirror. Why
Hmm.
was that important? Because we got to see our face, we got to hear ourselves, and it gave us the opportunity to adjust and practice our delivery, see how it sounded, see what our face looked like, and make an adjustment so that when we do it live and in person, we already feel more comfortable about our delivery because we practiced it. The other thing that often comes up is know about yourself. Understand your strengths and weaknesses and be able to communicate those without sabotaging yourself. So many times people go into an interview and one of the most common questions out there is, tell me about your weaknesses, or tell me about a time where things didn't go the way you wanted to. And if you go into that interview and you say something along the lines of, well, I walked into this situation, I had a bad attitude about it, and ultimately it just didn't work out. That's not where you want to leave your interview.
Right.
You want to be able to use what we call the PAR system. You want to be able to communicate, what the situation was, the action you took, and the results. So I walked into a situation and just seeing everything around it, I had a bad attitude about it. But the adjustment that I made was I began to change my perspective and I began to look at how all the pieces fit together. And I was ultimately able to fix this puzzle and all of the pieces worked. And I was able to give that customer great customer service. You're able to put together what the situation was, how you adjusted or adapted, and ultimately the end result of what came of it. John, what do you want to share about that real quick?
Well, kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent, but somewhat related. Um, I think on top of being able to kind of read the room and be able to be honest about your experiences, I think that um, something I've learned that recently was in my last job is just to know how to speak up and to know when to speak up. Because kind of on the other side of that coin, uh, when I went through the interview process of my most recent job, um, I actually applied for a warehouse position within the same facility. So we'd have a warehouse and the tech center within the warehouse. I wanted to be in the tech center. Only job application I could find was the warehouse. I'm getting through the interview process. It was a group interview, and it wasn't until like 30 minutes to like 45 minutes in where the interviewer pulled me aside individually, and then that's when I told her, hey, like, hey, by the way, I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to say anything, but you're asking me a question about this position. I actually wanted to interview for the tech center position. All of a sudden, she's like, she wasn't upset, but she was a godsend from God and from from Regency Technologies, because she's like, well, I just wish you said something sooner. I wouldn't have wasted your time. Um, and it was, and she had a lot of feedback on how to dress and how to carry myself, just much like you're talking right now. But I learned a vital thing where it really doesn't hurt to speak up for yourself, in the matter of just being honest for what you're looking for as well. um, I think that comment also put her in a place where she also generated a conversation about what she was looking for, and I had no issue sharing what I was looking for, and it kind of generated this a lot of honesty in the interview process. And it's not something that I've really experienced often, but it was really nice that I did get to have somebody honest like that in the interview process.
Awesome.
cool.
That's great. Well, that's it for this episode. We'll pick up from here next time. I'm David. He's Philip. And that's John. We'll see you.